Imagine standing on the vast steppes of Central Asia in the year 1206. The wind howls across endless grasslands, carrying with it the thunder of hooves. In the distance, you see them, thousands upon thousands of riders, moving as one living organism across the horizon. These are not just soldiers. These are the Mongols, and they are about to change the world forever. Welcome back to Neural Battlefields, where we dive deep into the military strategies, conquests, and untold stories that shaped human history. Today, we're exploring the most successful military force the world has ever seen. A force so devastating, so perfectly organized, that it conquered more territory in 25 years than the Romans did in 400. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, and I promise you, the truth is far more shocking than anything you've been taught in school. Before we begin, let me ask you something. What comes to mind when you hear the word Mongol? For most people, it's images of barbaric hordes, mindless destruction, and savage warriors. But what if I told you that this image, this narrative we've all been fed, is only half the story? What if the Mongols were not just destroyers, but also builders? Not just conquerors, but innovators who gave us systems we still use today. The story begins with one man. A boy, actually. Born around 1162, he was given the name Temujin. His father was a minor chieftain, poisoned by enemies when Temujin was just 9 years old. His family was abandoned by their tribe, left to starve on the harsh Mongolian plains. Temujin and his mother and siblings survived by eating roots, fish, and whatever small game they could catch. He was even captured and enslaved at one point, wearing a wooden collar around his neck like an animal. This was not the beginning of a conqueror. This was the beginning of a survivor. But Temujin learned something crucial during those brutal years. He learned that the traditional way of doing things, the old tribal systems based on blood and nobility, were broken. He learned that loyalty mattered more than lineage, that merit mattered more than birth. And most importantly, he learned that if you wanted to survive in a world designed to crush you, you had to rewrite the rules entirely. By 1206, through a combination of military genius, political savvy, and sheer determination, Temujin had united the warring Mongol tribes under his leadership. At a grand assembly called a Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, which means universal ruler. He was around 44 years old. Most men at that age are thinking about retirement. Genghis Khan was just getting started. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Because what Genghis Khan built wasn't just an army. It was a machine. A perfectly calibrated instrument of war that operated on principles so advanced, so far ahead of their time, that modern military strategists still study them today. Let's talk about the Mongol army itself. Forget everything you think you know about medieval warfare. While European knights were clunking around in heavy armor, spending years learning to fight on horseback, every Mongol child, boy or girl, learned to ride before they could walk. By the age of 3, they were already in the saddle. By 5, they were learning to shoot a bow while riding at full gallop. By the time a Mongol warrior reached fighting age, typically around 14 or 15, they had already spent a decade mastering skills that European knights took a lifetime to learn. The Mongol bow itself was a masterpiece of engineering. It was a composite recurve bow, made from layers of horn, wood, and sinew, glued together and wrapped in birch bark. It took over a year to make just one bow, and it could fire arrows with enough force to penetrate armor at 200 yards. A skilled Mongol archer could shoot accurately while riding at full speed, forwards, backwards, or to either side. They could fire up to 6 arrows per minute, and they carried between 60 to 80 arrows into battle. But here's what's truly shocking. The Mongols didn't rely on courage or bravery in the way European armies did. They relied on discipline and intelligence. Every aspect of their military was organized with mathematical precision. The basic unit was the arban, a group of 10 men. 10 arbans made a jagun of 100 men. 10 jaguns made a mingan of 1,000 men. And 10 mingans made a tumen of 10,000 men. This decimal system meant that orders could flow down the chain of command instantly. There was no confusion about who reported to whom. Every soldier knew exactly where they fit in the machine, and if one man in an arban deserted or showed cowardice, the entire arban could be executed. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a system designed to make desertion unthinkable and to ensure that every man was accountable not just to his commander, but to his brothers in arms. Communication on the battlefield was handled through a sophisticated system of flags, torches, and whistling arrows. A Mongol army of 50,000 men could execute complex maneuvers, splitting into multiple columns, executing feigned retreats, and converging on an enemy from different directions, all while moving at speeds that seem impossible even by modern standards. Let's talk about speed. This is perhaps the most underappreciated aspect of Mongol warfare. A typical Mongol warrior traveled with 4 or 5 horses. They would rotate between them during a march, never riding the same horse for more than a few hours. This meant that while their enemies were exhausted from riding one horse into the ground, the Mongols were always fresh. They could cover 60 to 100 miles in a single day. To put that in perspective, Napoleon's Grand Army, considered highly mobile for its time, could barely manage 15 to 20 miles per day. The Mongols could strike so quickly that by the time a city received word that a Mongol army had been spotted 200 miles away, that army was already at their gates. But speed and archery alone don't explain how the Mongols conquered an empire that stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Vietnam. The real secret was intelligence gathering and psychological warfare, and this is where the Mongols were centuries ahead of their time. Before the Mongols attacked a region, they would spend months, sometimes years, gathering intelligence. They used merchants, travelers, and spies to map out territories, identify political divisions, and understand the strengths and weaknesses of their enemies. They knew the terrain better than the people who lived there. They knew which cities were fortified and which were vulnerable. They knew which rulers were loved and which were hated. And then they would use this information with surgical precision. Here's an example. When the Mongols invaded Khwarezm in 1219, a powerful Islamic empire in Central Asia, they didn't just attack blindly. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors first, requesting trade agreements. When the governor of one of the Khwarezmian cities had those ambassadors killed, a massive diplomatic insult, Genghis Khan had his justification for war. But before he attacked, he sent spies throughout the empire, spreading rumors and propaganda. The psychological campaign was devastating. Stories spread of cities that had surrendered peacefully and been spared, juxtaposed with tales of cities that had resisted and been utterly annihilated. The Mongols would often allow a few survivors to escape from a destroyed city, specifically so they could spread terror to the next target. By the time the Mongol army actually arrived at a city, the defenders were already demoralized, already wondering if resistance was worth it. The Mongols also employed a terror tactic that sounds almost mythical in its brutality. When a city refused to surrender, the Mongols would sometimes construct pyramids of skulls outside the walls. Tens of thousands of skulls, stacked in neat geometric patterns, a monument to what happens when you defy the Mongol Empire. This wasn't mindless savagery. It was calculated psychological warfare designed to make the next city surrender without a fight. And it worked. Cities across Asia and Europe began surrendering at the mere rumor of Mongol approach. The fear was so pervasive that the Mongols often didn't even need to fight. Their reputation did the work for them. But here's what your history teacher probably never told you. The Mongols also had a policy of extreme tolerance for those who submitted peacefully. If a city surrendered without resistance, they were usually left alone. Their local leaders remained in power. Their religious practices were respected. The Mongols were religiously tolerant to a degree that was unheard of in the medieval world. Buddhist, Muslim, Christian, shamanist, it didn't matter. As long as you paid tribute and didn't rebel, you were left in peace. Genghis Khan himself consulted with religious leaders of all faiths. He exempted priests, monks, and religious scholars from taxation. The Mongol Empire became one of the most religiously diverse states in history, not because of some enlightened philosophy, but because the Mongols understood that allowing people to keep their beliefs made them easier to govern. The Mongols also revolutionized siege warfare. When they first began their conquests, they had no experience with sieges. They were steppe nomads. They didn't build cities, so they didn't know how to destroy them. But the Mongols were phenomenal at adapting and learning. After conquering northern China, they absorbed Chinese and Muslim engineers into their armies. These engineers brought with them advanced siege technology, catapults, trebuchets, gunpowder weapons, siege towers, and mining techniques. Within a generation, the Mongols went from being completely inexperienced in siege warfare to being the most effective siege army in the world. They would surround a city, cut off all supplies, and then bombard it day and night with catapults hurling rocks, flaming projectiles, and even biological weapons. There are accounts of Mongols catapulting plague-infected corpses over city walls, an early form of biological warfare that would spread disease through the defending population. When the walls were finally breached, the assault was swift and total. But even then, the Mongols showed their practical nature. Skilled craftsmen, engineers, and artisans were usually spared and relocated to other parts of the empire where their skills were needed. The Mongols weren't interested in killing everyone. They were interested in building an empire. Let's talk numbers for a moment, because this is where the true scale of Mongol conquest becomes clear. At its height, under Genghis Khan's grandson Kublai Khan, the Mongol Empire controlled approximately 24 million square kilometers. That's roughly 16% of the Earth's total land area. To put that in perspective, the British Empire at its peak controlled about 35 million square kilometers, but it took them centuries to build. The Mongols did 2/3 of that in less than a century. The empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. A Mongol messenger with a peza, a special passport, could ride from Beijing to Baghdad with the assurance of fresh horses, food, and shelter at way stations established across the empire. This postal relay system, called the yam, was so efficient that messages could travel 200 miles in a single day. For comparison, it took about a month for a message to travel from Rome to Britain during the height of the Roman Empire. This system didn't just facilitate military communication, it facilitated trade. The famous Silk Road, which had existed in various forms for centuries, reached its golden age under Mongol rule. For the first time in history, a merchant could travel from Europe to China with reasonable assurance of safety. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, made transcontinental trade safer and more prosperous than it had ever been. Ideas traveled with the merchants. Gunpowder, printing, paper money, the compass, all of these technologies spread from east to west along routes secured by Mongol power. It's not an exaggeration to say that the Mongol Empire accelerated technological and cultural exchange in ways that helped set the stage for the European Renaissance. But with all this success, why did the empire eventually fall apart? The answer is complicated, but it comes down to a few key factors. First, the empire was simply too large to govern effectively with medieval technology. Communication took weeks or months. Local governors had immense autonomy, which eventually led to fragmentation. Second, the Mongols were a minority ruling over vast conquered populations. As time went on, the Mongols began to adopt the cultures of the people they had conquered. The Mongols in China became Chinese. The Mongols in Persia became Persian. The Mongols in Russia became Russian. They were absorbed by the civilizations they had conquered. Third, succession disputes fractured the empire. Mongol tradition required that leadership be decided by consensus at a Kurultai. But as the empire grew, different branches of Genghis Khan's family began to prioritize their own regional interests over the unity of the whole. By the mid-1300s, the unified Mongol Empire had fractured into several independent khanates. The Yuan dynasty in China fell in 1368. The Golden Horde in Russia gradually weakened over the 1400s. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into competing states. The dream of a unified Mongol world empire died, but its legacy lived on. So what is the truth about the Mongols? Were they brutal conquerors? Absolutely. The death toll from their campaigns is estimated to be in the tens of millions. Entire cities were erased from existence. The Mongols could be utterly merciless to those who resisted. But they were also more than that. They were innovators who understood logistics, intelligence gathering, and psychological warfare in ways that wouldn't be seen again until the modern era. They were tolerant rulers who allowed religious and cultural diversity to flourish. They were the architects of a trade network that connected the world. They created systems of governance, communication, and law that influenced civilizations for centuries. The shocking truth about the Mongol Empire is that it defies simple categorization. It was both destroyer and creator, both terror and order, both barbarian horde and sophisticated state. The Mongols succeeded because they were willing to learn, to adapt, and to discard tradition when tradition got in the way of victory. Genghis Khan died in 1227, possibly from injuries sustained in a fall from a horse. The location of his tomb remains unknown, and according to legend, anyone who witnessed his funeral procession was killed to keep the location secret. Even in death, Genghis Khan remained a mystery. But his impact on history is no mystery at all. Genetic studies suggest that approximately 16 million men alive today, about 0.5% of the world's male population, are direct descendants of Genghis Khan. His empire, though it eventually fragmented, changed the course of human civilization in ways we're still discovering. The Mongol Empire teaches us that history is never as simple as good versus evil, civilized versus barbarian. It teaches us that the most successful empires are often those that can learn from their enemies, adapt to new circumstances, and value competence over tradition. And it teaches us that sometimes, the most feared armies in history are feared not because they're the most brutal, but because they're the most effective. So the next time you hear someone dismiss the Mongols as simply barbarians or savages, remember what you've learned today. Remember the decimal military system, the intelligence networks, the religious tolerance, the technological exchange. Remember that these barbarians built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, and did it with a level of organization and sophistication that rivaled or exceeded any civilization of their time. That's the shocking truth about the Mongol Empire. And that's why, nearly 800 years after its founding, we're still studying it, still learning from it, and still in awe of what it achieved. If you found this deep dive into the Mongol Empire fascinating, I'd really appreciate it if you consider subscribing to Neural Battlefields. We're building a community of history enthusiasts who want to go beyond the surface-level stories and discover the complex truths that shaped our world. Hit that like button if this changed your perspective on the Mongols, and share it with anyone who loves military history or just great stories of human achievement. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Did the Mongols deserve their fearsome reputation, or were they misunderstood? I'd love to hear what you think. Until next time, this is Neural Battlefields, where we explore the strategies, the battles, and the minds that changed history. Stay curious, and I'll see you in the next one.